I think that's the cue to hand over to me. So we're into part 2, and I'm going to share my screen shortly. But what I wanted to just mention that I didn't give you a comprehensive bibliography, but I have shared with you 3 articles that I think are, in the context of what we were talking about last week, quite interesting. They're kind of on the topic and around the topic. The first is the State of the Global Workplace Report 2022, which actually hasn't been out for very long. But that's more interesting than I've seen them in previous iterations. So it's about more complicated layering of what stops people doing good work, essentially. And there's a whole bunch of stuff there about learning. The second is something you probably won't have seen, which is about learning in the flow of work. It's a loop, L-O-O-O-P, loop presentation, a loop piece of research. So I think that it's an interesting perspective. It's not very big. It's not going to take you forever. But then I went and did the opposite, which is I gave you an academic article, which will take you forever. And it's called Organizational Learning and Learning Organizations, Trigger Events, Processes, Structures, and Learning Outcomes. So that is a more formal attempt to distinguish between organizational learning and learning organizations, or where organizational learning fits into learning organizations and vice versa. And I think it's actually quite a nice article. Scott, hi, I've just gone through, I circulated 3 articles after the last session, which are available online, which,
okay, thank you.
Yeah, some of you may want to look at that. By no means, I'm not insisting you do. But what I'll do is I will pick another 3 articles after we finish today. And what I try to do is kind of enrich the conversation. So I'll pick things that seem to relate to what we were talking about during the session. That strikes me as being the most useful. And
sounds good.
Yeah, they all lead on to other places. So that I think if you read them, they will suggest, and they do suggest, other things. So just a little thought. That's all. Nothing
thank you. My apologies for being late.
That's no problem at all. We've literally been going about a minute and a half. So you're very welcome, and I'm so pleased to see everyone. It's always slightly nerve-wracking at 3 minutes to, and there's absolutely nobody here.
Let's see the reality.
Depressing.
Yeah, remote meetings,
the reality,
back to back.
It is.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I feel for you. I shouldn't be so ridiculous as to imagine that I'm dominating in your life. I'm just on the sidelines, really. So
far from it.
So you can see the screen there, I hope. Yes. Yeah, it's visible. I'll make the slide much bigger when we get going. But what I want to do today is to really hone in on organizational learning, and by doing that, what I'm going to do is, in some ways, quite selfishly, give you my views and opinions, and create, I think, an opportunity for us to debate and to disagree. You may well find that everything I'm saying is a complete load of nonsense, and you want to challenge it. You may find it strikes a chord. I hope it strikes a chord, because towards the end of the session, I want to get you to think about your own organization, to reflect on the place that you work and what might be done, what you think may be a priority for your own organization, rather than believe me or just go with my paradigms. And at the end, I've got a number of case studies, which we may or may not get to. If we don't get to them, we'll do them in the 3rd session. But I've got some examples of where I think there are some interesting elements of organizational learning. So what I want to do then is just to make this bigger so that you will see, and it means that I kind of lose you almost. You're just on the, you suddenly move to the periphery of my screen rather than the center of my screen. And I can see the chat if I can get my mouse back. One of the problems I have, I don't know if anyone else has had that problem, is my mouse tends to disappear when I move into full screen, and I have no idea why. So Claire has had to go. They're available from Esther. the 3 documents are available in session 1, recording and resources. So as I say, I'll supplement that in session 2. Now, where's my mouse again? It's very annoying. Anyway, let's begin. Session 2, all about organizational learning. And just to reflect very, very quickly on what comes next, based around what you said before. This is your word cloud that you put together about what you wanted out of the 3 sessions that we're doing. And one of the big ones was insight, as you can see. That was the word that came up most. But you wanted insights beyond individual learners, the link between performance and organizational, individual performance. And I think that is organizational performance. Anyway, if it isn't, I want it to be, because I think that's a really good point. It's about change. It's about actionable insights, innovative approaches, developing my thinking, implementing a learning path worldwide. So lots of good points in there. And I've kept them in mind as I've gone into the preparation of this session. So I found that slide really helpful, and I'm sorry it took me most of the session to be able to recover it and display it. But I'm not going to use Slido this week, by the way. I'm just going to use the whiteboard that's available inside Zoom if we need to gather stuff together. So let's just move on. So I want to talk about a concept of organizational learning, and this is one of the overarching metaphors that I have found very helpful. I don't know how many of you have read Richard Powers' book, The Overstory. Essentially, it's a book about trees. And how can anyone write a 400-page novel on trees? Read it, and you will see it's an unbelievably passionate novel in defense of trees, essentially. And what he's saying is that a tree is not a tree, that a tree is part of a very complex ecosystem. And when you just cut a tree down, you're doing more than just cutting a tree down, basically. And he's defending the US ancient forests, which are being felled probably as we speak, and saying the folly of doing that, because you're undoing not just a tree, but an entire complex and powerful ecosystem. So I sort of parried him. This is a sort of quote from Richard Powers, but twisted by me, because I think that where he talks trees, I talk organizations. But I think for me it works, but we can talk about that. What I've said is organizations mend and shape themselves through invisible synapses. And in shaping themselves, they shape too the tens of thousands of people that work for and with them. Maybe it's useful to think of organizations as enormous, spreading, branching networks of connections. And for me, that sums it up. And what Powers has demonstrated pretty effectively using the science is that under the surface of the tree is not just the tree's roots, but a whole connecting system of life, animals, insects, chemicals, biomass that links together. So a forest is one thing, not just a series of individual trees. And that really got me thinking about organizational learning and organizations. And what struck me was he used the word synapses, and that triggered something for me. And I like to think of like our brain. Our brain has about 100 billion neurons. Somebody, when I said this in an audience, shouted out to me, "It's only 90." Right, okay. Between 90 and 100 billion neurons, and I don't know who's counting or how you would count 100 billion neurons, but let's not argue about a few billion neurons. But essentially, we all have similar number of neurons in our brain, but we're different, and we are. Some of us are able to do things better, faster than other people. We have different interests. Some of us are expert in one direction, some are expert in another. What is that? That's got nothing really to do with the mass of neurons. And if our intelligence was based on brain mass, then we'd be sitting serving elephants for the rest of our lives. Because elephant's brain mass is way, way bigger than a human's brain mass. So why aren't they smarter? Claire's come back. I'll just say hello again. Claire, well done. Can you see us, hear us? You back? Hi, Claire. Good to see you. Right, I'm just talking about what's on the screen, about and our brains. So what makes us smart is not the number of neurons, the density of neurons, it's the connections. And we know that. We know that from pretty much masses of neuroscience research, and we know it to be a fact that each of our neurons is capable of 1,000 connections. And it's that complexity of connections which makes us smart. And the more we rehearse those connections, the more we build neural plasticity, which allows us to make more connections more easily. And we also know that the brain is most plastic in the young child, age 2 or 3, when a child is just learning so much stuff. And all of us, if you've been around little children, sit with amazement at how they grasp language. A child can learn 50 words a day without learning anything. They just take them in by repetition. They form those links. And what not everybody knows is that a human baby is capable of speaking any language in the world. They're capable of speaking African languages, which are based on guttural clicks in the throat, which I can't even begin to attempt. But as soon as that child starts to learn a language, the rest of the ability, linguistic ability of sounds narrows down to concentrate on delivering that language better and competently. So that from maybe 4 or 5, that child is no longer able to generate certain sounds that a child from another culture can do really easily. Mike Kennedy is joining us. Hello, Mike. Mike, are you there? Can you hear us? Mike? Julie, you can hear us. Mike, you're there. Hi, can you hear everyone? Good.
Yes.
I'm talking around this slide. We haven't been going very long, so I'll just, if I may, I'll just continue, and then you can ask questions if you're not sure what on earth I'm going on about. So what I'm saying is I'm extending the metaphor of the brain to an organization, and to me, an organization is like a brain. It is not about the individuals, it's about the connections. So if you imagine your organization, every individual in it is a neuron. What makes your organization smart is the connections those individuals have. And the more the connections, the more those connections are reinforced and rehearsed, the stronger the links and networks, and the greater the organizational knowledge, and the greater the ability to access that knowledge extremely fast. And in times of turbulence, times of uncertainty like we live in now, that ability to reach into the depths of the collective consciousness of an organization and retrieve insight and knowledge, I think becomes unbelievably important, and more important, in fact. And yet it's not really recognized as an issue. We live in organizations of individuals where we focus on individual development, individual competence, individual excellence. We pay people based on their individual performance, reward them for that. And in some ways, no wonder they leave. Because if you believe that the reason why you're successful is because you're wonderful, why shouldn't you take that success and invest it somewhere else, which will pay you more maybe, or give you higher status, or do whatever? If you think that your smartness depends on that network around you of all the people that connect to you, then you'd be less willing, I would argue, to up and off, because you'll need to rebuild that connective tissue that makes you smart. And if you think that that is errant nonsense, then I would urge you to go and read Boris Groysberg's book about stars. I think it's called Shooting Stars or Falling Stars or something. Boris Groysberg is a Harvard professor. I knew him when he was at Penn. He was at Wharton in the early stage of his career when he was doing the research for this book. And what Groysberg discovered by working with high-flying financial people, financial services staff in New York-based financial institutions. What he found was the explanation for the conundrum that the financial services company came to him in the first place to help them with. And the conundrum is, how come when I've got someone like Rich James, Rich is so successful, he's unbelievably brilliant, he brings in hundreds of millions of pounds to this firm, he's great and we want him to stay. And then Rich is lured away by the competition by offering him an even more gargantuan salary and all sorts of perks that he could never have dreamt of in his first company. And funnily enough, Rich never performs to the level he performed in that first company. And so financial services people are saying to Groisberg, how come we've just grabbed Rich, we're paying him a fortune, and he's not delivering what we hoped he would deliver? And so Groisberg started a 5-year research project. And what he did was he tracked these individuals and these companies. And what he discovered, which is not incredibly astonishing, really, is that the reason that Rich is so successful in the first company is not Rich's inherent genius, although that's obviously there. What makes Rich successful in that first company is his support network, his researchers, the people he can go to get advice and guidance. You know, he's supported by maybe 30 or 40 people, plus an organizational database and organizational insights. They're the things that make him successful. And when you transplant him or anyone else to a brand new organization without that raft of support, Rich and others struggle. And so Groisberg did this research and he proves it. You know, he's got the data. So if anyone ever doubts, if anyone thinks that a genius in an organization is just going to be a genius in the next organization and the one after, all you need is to keep paying that person more. Groisberg completely demolishes that myth and shows that people, if you focus on individuals, you basically miss what's going on under the water. Just in that picture there on the screen, which I kind of love, that you focus on the root of the tree and you don't see what's under the surface, which is the network of support, all the chemicals, all the things that are going on to feed that tree and keep it growing successfully. And this is actually a video, so I'm going to play this video. It's an absolutely unbelievable video. Wow, there we go. I bet you haven't seen a video as good as that before. So it's just an amazing, you can see the kind of ecosystem underneath this tree. That's what keeps it going. And that's what keeps people going. And when someone says they're in a great organization, it's often the links and networks that lead them to make that statement. This is a great organization. This is why I love working for this place. And if you can make explicit and generate those processes consciously, my feeling is that my assumption is that you can build more successful organizations and you can create people who are happier at their workplace and who feel that there's a good reason to get up in the morning. And it doesn't mean you've got to sit with these people. It just means you've got to feel that sense of connection. And just as your brain forms habits and pathways, and the more you keep building, the deeper the pathways, the more you're able to continue to learn. And if you look at the stuff on the research that's coming out on dementia, for example, the more we find out, the more, and it isn't, but it led to a research institute in San Francisco to say, as far as we're concerned, dementia is a lifestyle choice. Now, that got outrage all around the world when they said it, because that isn't true. That our cards are dealt in different ways. Who knows what's going on in our brains and what's going to fall out from our brains in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time, or in my own case, about 18 months. That what happens is that we have genetic propensities, but we also have a real ability to do something about keeping our brains active, allowing that neuroplasticity to continue for the rest of our life, or we don't. And it's the same in organizations. You either focus some of your energy on creating that organizational network, that organizational linkage. You build those connections with and alongside the individuals in the organization, or you don't. And some of it happens because people connect with each other and they learn who to talk to and so on. But if you make it conscious, you really expand the complexity and knowledge sharing in an organization. Back to the point that I made in my, if you remember last time when I said that get the conditions right and everything falls into place, just as the conditions for learning have to be right for us to be effective learners. But the research that is coming out now is saying that there's absolutely nothing stopping people learning right the way through the whole of their life. There's nothing stopping a 90-year-old from exploring completely new things, apart from the fact that they've allowed the pathways in their brain to break down, so there's no neural plasticity, and apart from a belief, a self-denying ordinance in their head, which says, you're old, you can't learn anything. Only young people can learn. It's not true. People learn differently as they age, but they're still quite capable of learning. And the difference between us and any young whippersnapper that we happen to come across is not that they're super alert and we're kind of tired and dreary. The difference is that we have this massive well of experience that we can draw upon to help us in our learning process, which young people often do not have because they're that age. They just don't have that kind of experience. So in other words, there's a kind of wealth of embedded knowledge in individuals, which organizations can draw out, or for the most part, choose not to bother with and to mostly completely ignore. So we end up with this crazy idea that I came up with, which is that in a learning organization, the learning happens in the space between people. It is not about individuals. It's about the links and networks between them. What matters are the connections as much as the individual. So hyper-connected people who may not be individually talented can deliver more than a few highly talented individuals. And there's a book by an Indian friend of mine, which is called something like Don't Hire the Best. I think it's called that, Don't Hire the Best. And the reason he says don't, I'm just trying to, oh, here we are. Don't Hire the Best by Abhijit. I'll find it and I'll give you a reference to it. This is, there you can see it, I hope. Abhijit Vijay, what he's saying is, don't hire the best. You build the right team. You hire the people who learn fastest and work better with others. And you will end up with more productivity in the workforce than if you just go only for those individuals. And as you know, in Enron, if you read the case studies on Enron, who went into Harvard and Wharton and the top Stanford, the top business schools, and took the top 10 from each one and offered to pay them a ridiculous amount of money so they came. It doesn't always end well. When you only focus on you are a genius, it's all about you, when what it should be about is all about us and how do you build the most effective teams going forward. So that's what I want to get over. That's the first bit of the story that I want to talk to you about. So what I want to know is that clear, what I'm saying? Are there any questions that you've got? Is there anything that I've said which strikes you as being completely insane? Or is there anything that you want clarification of? Or do you want to agree or disagree? There should be some kind of intuitive backing to what I'm saying, because I think intuitively, but there's increasing research evidence that I'm right. And if I go back to the literature of organizational learning, that's more or less what they were saying in the 1990s, and we've forgotten it in the early 2000s. It's about building that fundamental ability to interrogate the knowledge of the organization that makes the organization successful, not about individual genius. And as I think I said in the last one, if you look at Chris Argyris's book on organizational learning, he doesn't once mention individual learning in the entire big fat book. He doesn't see it. He just thinks it's more important to focus on getting organizational learning right, because he's saying we seem to know what we're doing with individuals. We can do that stuff, but we can't do very much with, or don't do enough with organizational learning. So I'm gonna escape so I can look at the chat questions. Any points? Let me see if there's anything in the chat which I would like.
Nigel, I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
When you talk about a connection, I guess I'm wondering like what constitutes a connection? Because you can work with somebody, you can be on the same team, you can even be working on the same project, but there can be varying levels of effectiveness in how two or more people work together on something. So like what degree, like what counts as a connection? What is a useful connection? I don't know, can you just talk about that more?
I'm going to define it very crudely, and it's this. One, that you feel you can ask for help. And I think that's really important in a learning organization. If you feel you don't dare admit you don't know something, or you feel that you'll just be rebuffed if you ask for help, then it's not a rich connection. One, you can ask for help. Two, that you're more than willing to offer help and support when you are asked. So it's that two-way reciprocal willingness to share knowledge. And thirdly, that you get some kick out of helping others to develop and to grow their knowledge in a particular area, rather than resent the fact that you're going to have to spend time on taking this complete idiot, and sharing some of your genius with them when you could be doing much more important things. And you have an organization that recognizes those things. So that one of the case studies, WD-40 company, the managers, who are actually called coaches, they're not called managers, that when it comes to performance review, the performance review focuses on how well they developed their team, what their team did, and how they supported them, not about their own performance. Their performance comes through the team's performance, because they're in another team higher up the organization, and then that is all about how they worked as a team in that group. So it's focusing down the way, not up the way, not how well they please the CEO or the brownie points that they achieved, but in so far as how far they supported their team and made that team work together. So I'm being slightly prosaic. I'm not giving you very specific points, but I really think that it's not just the fact that you can nod to someone in the coffee queue, virtually or literally. It's more a deeper engagement. And I guess wrapped around that, back to my diagram on learning culture, is the idea that there are shared values. You think the same way, not you have the same opinions, but you share a group of values that help you define your behavior. And in WD-40 company, they have 5 values which are hierarchical. I've never ever come across an organization which has hierarchical values. In other words, you go for the first one and you don't move to the second one if the question is answered in the first one. If it isn't, you go to the second, you work your way through. So you make your decision in a hierarchical values-based way, and the whole organization lives and shares those values. So does that make sense? I'm just trying to pick up on the chat. There's a lot of really good stuff in the chat. Anyone wants to say anything else? Best age for exposure to foreign languages, i.e. as young children, yes. And the more research they do on bilingual kids, it changes their brain. Bilingual kids have different brains than monolingual, not literally different brains, but they're able to focus more conceptually. They're better at science and logic and so on, because very early on in their life, they've had to separate these two languages in their brain. And again, anyone who's worked with bilingual kids and see that amazing transformation from getting totally confused about the languages and speaking both languages equally in the same sentence without any real understanding of how they're separated, to suddenly being able to separate the two languages. And that's their brain having processed at a very deep level, and it's able to pull those two completely different frameworks apart. So that, and children are quite able to speak to mummy in one language and daddy in another language without blinking. Just do it. And if there's someone who's bilingual, they will speak to them in both languages. It's quite remarkable. But that does something to your brain to have to do that deep processing at such an early age. And for me, you know, I remember vividly, and this is embarrassing really, because I was around about 10 or 11. I remember the moment when I suddenly realized that when people spoke French, they weren't translating English in their head. I had assumed that if someone said chien, in their head was dog, dog is chien, chien. I had no idea that they actually thought completely differently in a different language where they didn't have any reference back to English. And that is very naive and sad. But that was because it was the first time I'd ever heard people speak another language, and the first time I'd ever been engaged with any kind of language that wasn't English. So I assumed that English was the language. Just as when the very first time I went to France when I was about 13, I was astonished to see the police didn't have big pointy hats and blue uniforms. And I just couldn't understand, how can there be police if they haven't got pointy hats? Because in my little reference world, police had pointy hats, all buses were double decker and red, and the language was English. And it was a major adjustment, realizing there were other people out there with totally different ways of thinking. And when they thought of that animal, furry animal on four legs, the word chien popped in their head, not dog, translated into chien. So I think that a child who's grasped that at 3 is going to do a lot better than me. But it took a huge number of years later to be able to really understand something that's pretty fundamental. I'm genuinely embarrassed to tell you that, but it's absolutely true. So neurons and social rules, Rich, can you explain that? What do you mean by neurons don't have social rules? They have rules because that's how they have chemical rules, if you like. That's how they connect. And
that's true. And I guess my later point maybe kind of gets to that. I mean, yeah, connections create the opportunity for information exchange.
Yes.
But they're sort of governed by the prevailing culture. Like there's allowed to say
yes
to certain people and certain things that
yes.
You can't. So like I see, I've been part of organizations that say, well, we want to increase our connections and our social learning. So let's create like a Yammer or some kind of platform where we can talk to each other. And then no one says anything because the way of working is not collaborative or cooperative, where we're still individualistic or siloed.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely.
It's more than creating the connections. It's what are the governing rules that facilitate the connections, I guess. Or the type
yes, exactly. So I'll go on, you say, I'll come back later. What were you going to say? Someone was going to add something. Was it you, mate?
Oh, I was just saying, no, I think it was me. Sorry, I was starting to think out loud.
No, do.
And I think, Rich, so what was occurring to me, just thinking very, I guess tactically, but more sort of having spent so many years in a learning production point of, in corporate, is quite often things boil down to, is it a course, right? Or what is the measurable unit? How can you show, just purely, what have you done this quarter, for example, or what so often it does, we did X number of courses, we've had X number of people take them, we've done, and so these are sort of tangible measurements that may or may not have anything to do with learning, and certainly may or may not have anything to do with organizational support. And Rich, it's an interesting thing, because I was, so part of it is, let's create the mechanism, right, for social communication, for social learning. But then purely tactically, because quite often we find ourselves in this situation, is how do we then show that there's been some kind of how do we show, what are the metrics, what are the measurements? And not that it's all about that, but that's often the brutal reality of being in that environment. And sometimes good learning doesn't always good learning practice doesn't always align with good organizational performance, should we say, based on the standards that are imposed upon us. And so Yeah, that was kind of, didn't have a specific conclusion, but really that was sort of my way of, I was thinking as you were going through, because I think, Nigel, absolutely, like, you're just looking at the slide, it is that communication, it is that space, it is that meaning creation, which is so key. But in L&D, we're often a small group that's separated, especially doing asynchronous learning. And what we create, what we're measured on, what we're directed on is different. Not that it should be that way, it's just that's the way it is. So how do we move those things together, right?
That's exactly right. That's the dilemma. And I think different organizations have different immediate needs. And one of the things I want to begin to focus us down on is, so what are the 2 or 3 things I have to do in my organization? How can I start to grease these cogs in order to get the machine to start moving in this direction? And that, in my experience, that is quite different. In most organizations have blockages that are not unique, but relatively unique to them. And it's trying to unlock those that makes the biggest difference. Because what, you know, again, in my experience, once you see things starting to roll, they really roll. It's almost, the momentum is unstoppable. Because what we're linking back to is that very quote that I started the session with, the very first session, which was, I'll just quickly share that, which was a Washington Post article I'd come up with, you know, I'd found the day of the thing, which is the US Surgeon General Vivek Murthy saying that, you know, abusive or cutthroat workplaces are harmful to human health. Now, I don't think anyone went, wow, what a revelation. I never thought. Who would have thought that toxic, vile workplaces harm human beings? Who would have thought? But the truth is that if you can create a climate where people do not feel they're in a cutthroat workplace, they're in a supportive, engaging workforce where human interaction is allowed, and you don't have to be in a, you know, in a particularly traditional workplace like a factory floor to feel that you can't talk to people, you never ask for help, you never admit vulnerability, you never tell the truth, you deflect blame. All of these things are modern characteristics that thousands of people experience, you know, millions probably on a day-to-day basis. What I'm saying is that is deliberately and directly unconducive to any kind of organizational learning framework. And therefore, there's maybe I'm stretching it a bit, there seems to me to be a happy medium where we begin to get the organization learning, which increases the level of performance, and it makes people feel they belong, they can learn, they can get help and support, they're not on their own, they're never going to be blamed for things that go wrong, etc., etc., etc. So you end up with something that is entirely different from where you started off, even if you begin this by thinking about creating an environment where learning, the organization learns faster than the individuals in it, which sounds illogical, but it's not illogical, because if you've got 1,000 people sharing a bit of their learning, that's always going to be creating more insight than one person who is sharing or not sharing anything. So it's that collective power that I want to get at. And I think it unleashes in those organizations where I've worked directly, I've seen what this can do, but it's a long journey. And if anyone has come into this thinking, we'll just do 3 sessions with Nigel, then it's all job done. You know, I'll go back and write a memo to the CEO, everything all done. Oh, perfect, excellent, well done, thank you. It's a long journey, but like all long journeys, you've got to start with the first steps, and these are the first steps, I think. And I will be amazed if we can't come together, we can't come up with 2 or 3 sometimes small things or some explorations that will help your organization move in this direction. And I think that there are side benefits around people's sense of belonging and their well-being, essentially. Plus, I think that when you can get stuff done faster because you know where to ask for help, you know where to go to help, that makes life hugely more motivating. Nothing is more frustrating in the workplace than struggling to work something out, which you know you should know, but you daren't ask anyone. So you're scrabbling through databases and trying to work out something that you probably knew how to do 6 months ago, but you just can't quite work it out. Or when you're 3/4 of the way through something and you can't finish it because you need something that is not immediately available to hand, and you don't know where to go to get help. So that it's that infrastructure. And the irony for all of this is that the last place you need to look for learning organizations are universities and institutions of learning. That one of the projects I'm working for at the moment is building communities of practice in a university, and they couldn't be further away from that notion of a community of practice, sharing laterally across the organization. Because not only is the organization, this university, driven, split by faculties, and inside those faculties departments, and inside those departments units, and it's hard to even get a department to talk together without resentment and challenge. They're alone, a faculty, they're alone, the whole university. So it's almost the most difficult organization I've ever had to deal with, which is trying to shift a university, because it's just not built around organizational learning, which is ironic. It's built around a different kind of learning, but it's certainly not organizational learning. And the last bit I wanted to share with you, which I think I talked very briefly about last time, is this concept of self-determination theory. And as I said before, the key to me, it is about competence. But if you focus only on competence, you miss the other two elements of motivation. And they are equally important. That you don't have competence 5 times bigger than the other two. They're all the same. And the first is that sense of autonomy, that ability to be endorsed, to operate with impunity in certain areas that you know stuff about without being micromanaged. But the third is the one that I feel is really important: the need to feel connected and belonging. That sense of belonging and connectedness. It's in that area that I think that the sense of organizational learning comes in. If you feel connected and belonging, I know that goes back to the point you made at the beginning, Rich, that these are social things. But I think in the context of self-determination theory, they are about that ability to get your job done effectively in conjunction with others, and not feel that you're living this a lonely life. And most of us in our working careers will remember times when you felt terribly alone, usually when you were struggling and when you realized that you were going to get the blame for all this, or when something was going down badly or a project wasn't working, and you just have that horrible cold feeling that everyone's going to walk away and leave it with your name attached, and you're going to be in trouble as a result of this. So any other, have I missed out on anything? Is there anything good coming in that I've missed in? Right. So Mike, explain what you mean. My concrete challenge at the moment is that in advertising, the subculture is defined to extent by the clients. Go on then, tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, so, and this is a new industry for me. I'm 9 months into my role here, and this actually connects really well to some of what we're thinking about, which is that people are very clearly more oriented here to learn in groups than they are individually through things like open enrollment, right? So yeah, great positive. But you know, our teams are, these are large teams, maybe literally hundreds of people supporting a particular client, right? And so it feels as if the culture of the organization itself has developed to compensate or almost overcompensate for the extent to which clients are not particularly mindful of creating psychological safety or even just a baseline of courtesy towards their account teams. And so what we are pushing uphill is that agreed on all of this. And is there some, I mean, it's also a leadership issue, clearly, right? Because the leaders within those teams need, we need to work with them to redirect or to find the ways to teach their clients that there are benefits to not being abusive or deterring people from creative solutions, and acting as consultants rather than just order takers in their business as well.
Yeah.
So anyway, so yeah,
Yes.
so that's what we're swimming upstream against.
Yeah, it's a massive challenge. And what I've always found in my work, and I've come across that a lot, that I get asked to come in to help with developing some kind of leadership experience or something like that. And what I find is that's an utter waste of time, because the whole culture and ethos around it is just working against everything that I'm told is what they want from their leadership teams. So, I use my old trick of field work. And what I mean by that is that I go out and I talk to people. I never quote them, but I do write down their words. And I have a conversation with the organization and say, this is the kind of organization that exists here. Are you aware of that? And how can I do my job when this is the prevailing views and culture? What do you say? And I've had two reactions. One is like, that is a revelation, and thank you. Let's just pick up that. Let's work on that together, because I think that's the most important thing that anyone has ever said to us, in the last 2 years. Or they say, you're mistaken, go ahead and do your job. And when they say you're mistaken, go ahead and do your job, it usually means that, I'm on a very short wicket. I don't want to last long, and I'm not going to last very long. And I'm actually okay with that. I'd rather be honest and have that conversation. And I leave it with them. That and maybe it might not get picked up immediately. Maybe it might not get picked up by me. But at some point, I have a belief that some of those seeds take root, and the organization starts to move. Because otherwise, you're just wasting your time. And there's no point in putting in frameworks for organizational learning. And I come to your point, Heather, about that. I want to talk about that. There's no point in putting in formal frameworks if the culture is rotten, and where no one listens, people pay attention according to where you are on the hierarchy, not by the quality of what you're saying, and where everyone is living this kind of facade life of pretending they are someone that they're not. And it's very, 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 very divisive. And I don't know if I mentioned last time that I have a student at Paine who did her doctoral dissertation on covering. And she's African-American woman, and she spent her whole career trying to be as much as like a white woman as she possibly could. Things like hair straightening and the way she dressed, the way she spoke, and realizing, at a decent age, that she'd just been wasting energy and time when she could have been more productive. So she did her doctoral dissertation. What she discovered was an average of 15% drop in productivity because people are masking. And it's not just about African-American women and the way they dress and their hair. It was about, gay men. It was about people who felt that they weren't exactly fitting the culture. So they kind of reinvented themselves and lived a complete lie in order to what they thought fit in, and the more she explored it, the more incredibly powerful it appeared that many organizations, people spend their whole careers masking, and the result is always negative. Nothing good ever comes of it. And her research is a kind of plea to create opportunities for unmasking, for people to be themselves, and in my terms, to admit what they don't know, to ask for help when necessary, and to not deflect around the fact that we all make mistakes, we all have errors of judgment, we all get things wrong, and the fact that some people simply hide all that stuff is sad. And it's not just 3% of the workforce, and it can be most of the workforce. It's masking in some way. So Heather, you've just said The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Dahlia Harris. What is it? Tell us about it, Heather. What is it about?
It's actually a novel, and it's
right,
like a bit of a thriller almost, but it's set in a publishing house. And it's, yeah, it's really interesting. It follows sort of like the main character, but also a few other characters, kind of ties in their experiences, like from the 1980s through to sort of like it's mostly set in 2018. But yeah, really good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And let's pick up on your point. You're thinking about the role of formalized processes for sharing knowledge and how this might tie in with equity, diversity, and inclusion. If knowledge is only shared within the clusters, people lose out. Yes, I think that's right. And in WD-40, their view is that all knowledge should be openly shared and accessible by all staff, unless there's a very, very good reason for it not to be. So clearly some things don't get shared, but lots of things do get shared. And if you have a kind of open philosophy that every employee is trying to do good work, and therefore they need access to as many resources as they can in order to do good work, then I think you end up somewhere in a better place than if you think that every employee is trying to diddle you, sell your data and intellectual property, is not to be trusted and has to be limited extremely rigidly on what they can access and what they can't. It depends on the organization, because there need to be firewalls for good reason in certain places. But I think overall that if you don't have what I've just described, you do start to bump in very quickly into equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. And because you find that certain groups of people are excluded and certain groups of people are included, and you get an in and an out, and then you get the frustration of, I can't do my job properly because I'm not allowed that access to data. The number of people who have told me of how they're prevented from doing good work or even doing work because they're not given access to certain key resources. They have to go and ask on a case-by-case basis, and that takes a long time, and it's not popular when they do it, and so on and so forth. So yes, but the other point wrapped in your comment, Heather, is the one of formalized processes. And I think that I've kind of given the impression that if people just kind of bump into each other and it's all very cozy-wozy, that's all you need. I don't think it is. I think you do need that climate, and that's where the formalized processes break down. When you don't have that climate, you don't have the values that we've been discussing, that Rich talked about at the beginning. So that if you do have that, then you do need to formalize it in some way. You need to have places and spaces where people can come together. The Google, for all its faults, does have a really great climate where people work on problems and where they're open to anyone in the organization helping them solve challenges. And they do have, really good use of, often online whiteboards, shared whiteboards and online post-its. And they also have spaces in every office where, 4 or 5 people can come together and just talk through an issue, either in a room where they just need to sit on a table, or where they need a room where they can plaster the walls with ideas. But it's seen as an important part of it. And interestingly, when I was talking to Zoom, that Zoom obviously, as it grew so fast in the pandemic, became a completely 100% remote organization. So they now have 4,000 staff, 3,600 of whom never had any access to Google each other except for remotely, and never had access to Zoom offices. So in trying to get people to come back to the office, what Zoom realized really smartly, I think, is that you don't send a memo out saying you will now come back to the office 2 days a week from Monday, signed CEO, a la Apple. And what you end up with is massive resentment and huge pushback and a climb down. What Zoom did was that they said that they would make every office so desirable that people would want to come in to do the community thing. So they got rid of all of the kind of single desks and workstation ideas. So you can do that at home. If you're going to work on an email, go and do it at home, or do it in a cafe. You don't have to come into a Zoom office to do it unless you want to. But where the office shines is to build those little communities. So they created these smaller, medium and big spaces where people could work together, share ideas, or even just simply sit quietly if they needed to reflect. So they redesigned the offices for what they called 21st century work. And I've never been in a Zoom office, so I can't attest to how successful that's been, but I have talked to Zoom staff, and their view is that there's been a massive improvement in the last 6 to 8 months in the environment of the organizations, to a point where most people go in at least once a week if they can get to local offices. And it's kind of stopped people getting up and moving to, you know, north of Vancouver Island when they're based in San Francisco, because who cares, it doesn't matter where I happen to be based. And they're staying, you know, somewhere where they can actually travel in when it's necessary to travel in, and they get a chance to get to know, to meet and to share with each other. And that creates a dimension of engagement that hadn't been there when they were all 100% remote. So I think the formalized stuff is really important, and everyone has to work out what works best for them. I don't know what it might be, but it only works best in the context of an informal and a cultural agreement that this is a great way of working and this is a good way to spend your time, and that therefore I guess it also reflects on things like remuneration. If you focus on, if you say you've got to be collegiate and you've got to share, but we're going to give you your bonus, Heather, on how well you perform your KPIs, which are yours, you've got to do them on your own. It just contradicts completely. So you do what WD-40 does, which is follow it all the way through. So you get your bonus based on the team's performance, and the team's performance, part of the bonus is your team, part of the bonus is your division or your bit of the organization, and part of it is the overall organization performance. But hardly any of it is on your performance, apart from insofar you helped your team. So that is your individual performance, not how many things you did. Thanks, Scott. I'm sorry you've got to leave. Okay, what I want to do is just to put you into well, not the first, the only breakout. And what I want you to do is, let me see if I can find the breakouts. They should be in there somewhere. Help. Esther, I can't. Oh, yes, I can. Breakout rooms. What I'm going to do is just put you in 2 breakout rooms. I think that'll be enough. And what I want you to do is just reflect on the implications. So, if you agree with this, so what are the implications for your organization, for you? What are things that you perhaps should start doing that you haven't been able to do or haven't done already? And what are the things you may want to stop doing that you might have thought that you should continue doing? So how is it changing? How is this kind of impacting on your on the way you're thinking about your role and about your organization? So I'm going to create those breakout rooms, and I'm going to give you about 10 minutes, that's all. So I'm going to open, there are only 2 rooms, so I'm going to open them now. Hey there. Thanks for that. I was going to come into the rooms, and I got talking to Esther, so I didn't. But you're probably very relieved that I didn't bother you. So let's just get some feedback from the groups. So implications. Can we just the first group was who was the first group? Let's have a look. First group was Heather, Julie, and Rich. What about you?
I'll try a little summary. We talked about adopting the habits of sharing. So when you have a conversation and have a great insight, how does that get to other people? Yeah, need to know that. As an organization grows and you have lots of communication channels, like what point do you need to begin filtering and managing that information flow, and how do you do that effectively? We talked about sort of where knowledge management kind of overlaps with this. So you create a lot of resources and dialogue threads around a project that have value, but then how does someone find that in an expedient, relevant way? How does that get packaged or linked, so people can use that? And then we spent the end kind of talking about the risks of asking questions. You know, like sometimes it's better to ask a question than to search the documents. But then is there a risk in asking that questions in terms of either maybe showing your ignorance or maybe challenging someone or getting on someone else's turf? And there's a whole other, there's a range of risks with asking a question depending on the culture.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember in the early online forums, there used to be the RTFM used to come up all the time. And when you say, and how do you just come back with RTFM exclamation mark, which meant read the effing manual. In other words, don't ask me questions unless you've done your research, which is incredibly humiliating and was designed to humiliate you essentially. And there are similar things that go on in organizations. You should know that. What do you mean you're asking this question? So, you know, we're back to culture, aren't we, Rich? We're back to culture. But yes, I think, you know, how do you handle that information? How does it get, where is the repository? How does it get accessed? All of those, the Heather questions, I call those, I think that those formal questions are really, really important. And we need to have some way of addressing that. And that may be the first thing to do, because if you create something that is too mechanical or complex, people won't look for it. If you create something that is too kind of free and flowing, people won't be able to find anything. So how do you get stuff that people want and that they can find? It's very difficult. When I joined the BBC, there was a contract for autonomy, which, if you remember autonomy, there's a great history about autonomy, you know, defrauding HP, selling themselves way too expensively to HP. They were a knowledge management company and based around software and files and notes and all this stuff. And I stopped it on the day we were due to formally sign the contract, because I just thought this is never going to work in our culture. And I'm very glad I did, because I think it would have been £250,000 at those days, you know, $350,000 right down the drain. Because it was so, I didn't like autonomy, just something about autonomy that I did not like. It was just way too mechanical. The processes were too ridiculous and complex. And I thought about me, and I thought, would I ever bother to fill in one of their stupid screens in order to be able to deposit this knowledge in one of their stupid repositories? And I thought, I'll never do that. I'll never do that. And we ended up in the BBC, we just used free form tags. We just let stuff tag, people tag things, and it was way more effective because people tagged them in the way that they wanted, and tags had a helpful way of clustering. And if two tags are almost the same, then they would all end up in the same place anyway. It didn't really matter. But tagging was a more, I don't sound a bad word, natural, but it suited the culture of the organization. Just to say, don't do anything without tagging. And tagging allowed us to group and regroup as well. So we continuously reorganized information and we had it in different places. So something that could be about, you know, how you did editing in Prague would fit perfectly well into what are the best value editors on the market, or, you know, how do you do this particular thing with this particular piece of software. So the one piece of information could end up in 5 or 6 places, and that was fine because we had infinite storage, but the key was access, not storage. Once upon a time, it used to be storage. You remember, you used to worry about how expensive it was to store more than X amount of data. I remember when I joined the BBC, we were only allowed to store online 10 megabytes of information. Each member of staff had 10 megabytes. Can you believe that? You know, I got through, I overspilled that in about a day. And got shouted at by the IT people for not deleting. So, you know, people didn't keep stuff, you know, they just deleted. All that knowledge disappeared. So what about Heather and Julie? Have you got anything that you wanted to add to that point that Rich was making?
I think Rich had a great summary, and Julie posted about Glean in the chat, and I'm already like on their website because I think it looks super useful.
Yeah, thank you. Because you know, that part of it is find the right piece, mostly software, but the right way of doing it. Glean, yeah, help search everything we have. And that there's a new app which some company has just launched. It's in the early stages. I've signed up for it, but I'm in the queue. And basically, it's like a collective memory on an individual memory on your machine. It doesn't forget anything, so that it finds all the disparate bits of information and pulls them together for you when you need it. And it just does that in the background. You don't have to do anything apart from carrying on your life. And I think that's sort of artificial intelligence being used to help pull together individual, team and organizational knowledge is probably the way forward. So it doesn't require, the last thing it's ever going to require is filling in forms. No one's going to fill in forms. No one. And that's what autonomy was based around. It didn't look like that, but that's basically what it was. Glean, yeah, thank you for that. And some of my flat music files are 10 megabytes, exactly. 10 megabytes. Everything in your life for one organization had to be under 10 megabytes. It showed you what they really thought about knowledge sharing. Okay, the other group, Claire and Mike and Shelley.
Yeah, so I don't know that we carried out the implications piece. We more reflected on how what we've been talking about applies in our own settings. It was interesting. I think Mike and I bonded a bit about having some really similar organizational dynamics to solve for. And so how do we export some of these ideas to our field teams? Because that's where we operate. I work in franchising and we've got 1,000 locations nationwide. And so
exactly.
Yeah, it's influencing the culture of all of those. Yeah. So we were kind of brainstorming ideas about, how do you do that? How do you get to managers with these ideas to start to move things in that direction? Claire talked with us about some of the training that she's working on and some of the ideas that this session sparked for sharing ideas within those programs. So we kind of focused on application.
That's fine. Good. Thank you. Anyone want to add anything? Do you want to add anything, Claire or Mike? That's okay. Good. Thank you. But 1,000 franchisees, that is a wonderful opportunity, because how much knowledge is locked in there that never comes out. If you can crack that, you'll be a genius. You'll be running the organization. But the fact that it's hard doesn't mean you shouldn't. The fact that it's hard means you should, I think, because it will just do a huge amount. And we started off, if you remember, with that quote from the CLO of McDonald's, and she's in exactly the same position. She's got thousands and thousands of franchisees all over the world, and they've got to kind of move forward at the same pace, and they've got to share good ideas and enable them to be implemented across the organization. It's a really interesting challenge. And I remember working with John Deere with each one of their dealers was saw their main competition being all the other dealers with John Deere, and to try and get that idea that they actually might benefit from sharing what worked, not hiding what worked, which is where we started. Because that was their philosophy, that they're in a permanent war with their fellow dealers, which isn't true at all. They were mostly, there was no evidence for that, maybe teeny overlap, but most dealers had their loyal customers, and they didn't pick and choose around John Deere dealerships. But the organization felt that intensively, that sharing was not a good thing, it was a bad thing. And to get that notion of sharing across and create vehicles for it are really important. I remember that I was working with someone who, there's a mattress company in the US. Is it called the Mattress Company? Is there something called the Mattress Company? I don't know, it doesn't matter if there is. I think it was one of the, he had loads and loads of shops, and they were in big, deep trouble. And he was looking for help in how they could solve the problem. And one of the things I suggested to him, saying that in this network, there are salespeople doing amazing things individually in their one shop, or maybe just themselves with their customers. If you can bring that out, then you are going to transform the organization. And he did just that. He did it by kind of bribery. He got shops to video each other inside the shop, to video, talk about what they did, or maybe even sometimes illustrate what they did. And the shop that came up with the best ideas got special bonus points. And so he turned it into a bit of a competition between the shops, but it meant that all the best ideas were immediately accessible and everyone watched them because it was on video and they needed to watch, and they voted for the best. They couldn't vote for themselves, they could vote for other people. And it just got the whole organization talking to itself. And that, at a time of stress and trouble, that kind of felt like a problem halved is a problem solved, or, you know, whatever the expression is. The more people who were working on the same thing, the more it felt like, you know, together they could come up with something, because the shops weren't in competition with each other at all. But in reality, they never ever spoke to each other. And so some shops did some things brilliantly and other things terribly, and no one tried to balance it all out. So I think sharing ideas is really important, and it works. You know, this stuff works. But back to Heather's point that, you know, you can't run internal competitions forever. You've got to have a better, more structured way of getting the best practice, you know, out of those stores and, you know, generally available to everyone. And that was I never got involved beyond that, but to me, that would have been the next stage if I was that guy, which is how do we turn this into the status quo, the way we do things quite naturally and normally in this organization. And that is a big dilemma for everyone. And that is partly about culture, the thing we need to do. And it's partly about having the processes that are obvious and right there at hand so that you behave differently. We are talking about changing behaviors fundamentally, and you've got to make that easy for people. Otherwise they won't change if it's too difficult, which was back to my gripe with autonomy. You know, they made it so complicated. I didn't think anyone was going to change any behavior at all. Okay, any points that anyone, questions or issues that anyone would like to add? Because what we're going to do next time, what I'm going to do is I want you to go back to your organization and think about your organization and come back with some examples of where things are happening and where you think there's real opportunity for things to happen. It just takes not much of a nudge, but just to go take some of these ideas and reflect them back and say, well, I think if we did this, that might work. So to some potential experiments that you could run in your organization. What could I do? And I'm sure that you've all got really good ideas and examples that we can pull. And I want to pull those in the next session. So if you come back with your ideas, we can get each of you to just do a little 2 or 3 minute presentation on where you think you've got strengths and where you think you might go. And then the last stage is to just to come up with a plan, basically. So I'm just reading Esther. Esther's saying, recording and resources available shortly, also office hours. If anyone wants an individual insight into this, I'm doing them tomorrow at 9 a.m. ET. So last time no one signed up, and that's okay. I'm not looking for more work. But if anyone does want to have, you know, a 10-minute conversation, then you're very welcome to come in to the office hours if that would be useful. But it's entirely up to you. I'm not expecting you to. And as I say, hour of my life back, not too bad. I'm also going to post 3 more articles that I'll get Esther to put on the system. I'll do that tomorrow as well, so that I'll keep, you know, giving you some rich food for thought, which you don't have to read, but I'd like to make it available if it's useful to you. And again, some things strike a chord and are going to be good, other things not interested, and I think that's fine. You're your own best judge. But can I just finally just leave? I'm going to start with this next week, but if I can just end with where I'm going to start next week. This is my little model that I put together recently for a session on skills, and it's kind of my philosophy of skills. If there's an issue about developing skills, doing it in isolation is never going to help. If there's an issue about anything, you've got to prepare both the individual and the organization and change the culture. It's the culture that is going to make it work or not make it work. The culture will grind in and stop something, or it will lubricate it and ease it. But so I think that's to me anyway, that's a useful way of looking at this whole dilemma. It is about the individual's preparation, but it's about organizational preparation. And you create a climate which is partly about having new skills to do things differently, but the right mindset and the right tool set. And maybe we've got a brilliant tool in Glean. That could be our tool du jour. And we can talk about that next week. Any other points? Because I'm going to stop now. We've done it enough. Anyone?
Thank you, Nigel.
That's okay. No problem.
Let me just stop the recording.